They said money could buy anything, but in the Romano mansion, 50 professional chefs had just proved that wasn't true. Victor Romano stood at the head of a 12-foot marble dining table as the latest untouched plate was carried away, the silver cloche still gleaming under a crystal chandelier that cost more than most homes in Brooklyn. Across from him, 8-year-old Ethan Romano sat small in an oversized leather chair, his dark eyes fixed somewhere beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The sea bass flown in from Italy, the organic vegetables sourced from a farm in Napa, the broth simmered for 6 hours by a Michelin-starred chef. None of it mattered. Ethan didn't lift his fork. He hadn't for 3 days. Get him something else. Victor had ordered the first night, his voice controlled but tight. Something else became something better. Better became the best money could buy. By the end of the week, 50 chefs had rotated through the Romano kitchen, each one leaving with a check and quiet humiliation. The headlines were already whispering about the heir who wouldn't eat. Investors noticed everything. Weakness traveled fast in Victor's world. Doctors had examined Ethan from every angle. No infection, no allergies, no physical cause. It's grief, one specialist had said gently. He needs comfort. Victor understood negotiations, territories, numbers that stretched into the hundreds of millions. Comfort was a language he had never learned to speak. Since his wife passed away the previous winter, the mansion had grown quieter, colder, its polished floors echoing with absence. Staff moved like shadows. Conversations stayed practical. Feelings were inefficient. That afternoon, as another chef packed his knives into a leather roll, a delivery truck pulled into the service entrance. Lillian Brooks stepped out carrying 2 crates of produce balanced against her hip. She was 42, dark-skinned, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, wearing worn sneakers and a faded denim jacket against the Chicago wind. She wasn't a chef. She wasn't even kitchen staff. She worked for a small food supplier on the south side, filling in for a co-worker who'd called out sick. The security guard barely looked at her as he waved her through. Inside the Romano kitchen, stainless steel counters shined like mirrors, and tension hung thicker than steam. Lillian set down the crates and began unloading tomatoes, onions, fresh corn, moving with quiet efficiency. In the corner, she noticed a pot of discarded vegetable scraps, ends of carrots, celery leaves, pieces no one important would ever see. She hesitated, then asked the sous chef if she could take them. He shrugged. We're throwing it out. While the staff argued about the next high-end menu strategy, Lillian rinsed the scraps in the sink and began simmering them in a small saucepan, adding a pinch of salt from her pocket and a splash of olive oil left in a near-empty bottle. The scent that rose wasn't extravagant. It was warm, familiar, the kind of smell that drifted through small apartments on cold nights. Upstairs, Ethan lifted his head for the first time all day, and in a house where 50 chefs had failed, something simple had just begun to change the air. The aroma reached the second floor before anyone announced it. It slipped past polished banisters and framed oil paintings, softer than perfume, yet stronger than any imported truffle oil that had filled the kitchen that week. Ethan lifted his head from the couch where he had been lying with a blanket over his shoulders, the television flickering silently in front of him. For days he had ignored the clatter of plates and the murmured negotiations of adults who spoke about him, as if he were a fragile investment. But this scent was different. It did not demand attention. It invited it. Downstairs, Lillian stood by the small saucepan, stirring slowly with a wooden spoon she had found tucked behind a drawer of unused silver utensils. The broth had turned a gentle amber, corn kernels floating beside softened carrots and celery. It was nothing she would have charged for. Nothing that would have appeared on a linen menu. It was the kind of soup her mother used to make in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side when paychecks ran thin and winter felt endless. One of the kitchen assistants wrinkled his nose. That is not on the schedule, he muttered. Lillian gave a polite nod. It is not for the schedule. She ladled a small portion into a plain white bowl, the only dish without gold trim. As she set it on the counter to cool, she felt a presence behind her. Ethan stood in the doorway of the industrial kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, his dark hair slightly tousled, his expression guarded but curious. No one had seen him come down the stairs. The staff froze. A chef who had not yet been dismissed stepped forward instinctively, but Ethan did not look at him. His eyes were fixed on the bowl. "What is that?" he asked, his voice quiet from disuse. Lillian turned slowly so she would not startle him. "Just vegetable soup," she said gently. "Nothing special." Ethan stepped closer, inhaling. It did not smell like the elaborate meals that had been paraded before him. It smelled like warmth, like something made without pressure. "Can I try it?" The question echoed louder than any command Victor Romano had given all week. At the far end of the hallway, Victor appeared, drawn by the unusual silence. He stopped when he saw his son standing in the kitchen instead of at the dining table. He noticed the bowl in Ethan's hands. He noticed the woman beside him, unfamiliar, dressed in a delivery jacket rather than a chef's coat. Lillian knelt slightly, so she would be eye level with the boy. "It is hot," she said softly. "Small spoon." Ethan nodded. She handed him the spoon and watched as he dipped it into the broth. The entire kitchen held its breath. Ethan blew gently, then took a sip. His shoulders relaxed first. Then his grip on the spoon loosened. He took another bite, this time without hesitation. Victor felt something shift in his chest, subtle but undeniable. For the first time in weeks, his son was not pushing a plate away. He was pulling it closer. And in that stainless steel kitchen where expertise had failed and reputation had collapsed, a simple bowl of soup was doing what power could not. Victor Romano did not speak for several long seconds as Ethan finished the last spoonful and tilted the bowl slightly, trying to gather what remained at the bottom. The kitchen staff exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for instructions, for a correction, for the sharp command that usually followed any deviation from order. Instead, Victor stepped forward slowly, his polished shoes echoing against the tile. "Ethan," he said evenly, careful not to startle him. "Are you done?" Ethan shook his head without looking up. "More." It was the first decisive word he had spoken at the table in nearly a week. Lillian felt every eye shift toward her. She rose quietly and returned to the stove, ladling another portion into the same plain white bowl. She did not rush. She did not perform. She simply handed it back to the boy with the same calm steadiness. Victor studied her closely now. She did not look intimidated by the size of the kitchen or the weight of his gaze. There was no calculated smile, no eager explanation. Just composure. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lillian Brooks," she replied. Her voice carried the warmth of someone used to being overlooked and the strength of someone who had learned not to bend. "You are not on my staff list." "No, sir. I am filling in on a delivery route." Ethan finished the second bowl and placed it carefully on the counter as if it were something valuable. He looked at Lillian, not at his father. "Can she cook tomorrow?" The question landed heavier than any negotiation Victor had handled that month. The chefs who remained standing stiffened. A man with a culinary award pinned to his jacket cleared his throat as if to remind the room of his credentials. Victor raised a single hand, and the room fell silent again. He crouched slightly, so he was closer to Ethan's height. "If that is what you want," he said. Ethan nodded, then did something Victor had not seen since the winter. He reached out and lightly held the edge of Lillian's sleeve, as if afraid she might disappear. The gesture was small, but it carried a message stronger than appetite. Victor stood and faced the kitchen. "All scheduled tastings are canceled," he said calmly. "Effective immediately." The head chef blinked in disbelief. "Sir, we have investors dining here on Friday." "Then they will dine on what my son eats," Victor replied. No one argued after that. Lillian looked between father and son, uncertain of her place in a decision that felt larger than soup. "I should return to my route," she said softly. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around her sleeve. No, it was not defiance. It was fear of loss. Victor saw it clearly now. His son was not refusing food. He was refusing emptiness. "Miss Brooks," Victor said after a measured pause, "I would like you to stay for dinner. We can arrange your employer's compensation." Lillian hesitated, then gave a small nod. She was not stepping into wealth. She was stepping into a space that needed warmth. And for the first time in months, the Romano kitchen did not feel like a stage for perfection. It felt like a place where something human had quietly taken root. By evening, the Romano mansion felt different, as if the air itself were waiting to see whether the change would last. The sun dipped behind Lake Michigan, casting long gold reflections through the glass walls, and for the first time in weeks the dining room was not prepared like a formal banquet hall. No imported orchids. No 12-course tasting menu. Just a polished oak table set with 3 simple place settings. Lillian stood in the kitchen wearing an apron one of the assistants had quietly handed her. She had declined the embroidered chef coat offered moments earlier. "This is fine," she had said, tying the strings behind her back. On the stove simmered a pot of chicken and rice soup, seasoned gently, alongside skillet cornbread baked in a cast-iron pan she had found stored in the back cabinet, and used, and slightly dusty. The professional chefs who had not yet packed their knives watched from a careful distance. Some were offended. Others were curious. None dared interrupt. Upstairs, Ethan waited at the staircase instead of being called to dinner. When he saw Lillian step into the hallway to announce the meal, he walked beside her, not behind. Victor noticed that immediately. The three of them sat down without ceremony. Victor observed how Lillian served Ethan first, placing the bowl in front of him and blowing lightly across the surface to cool it before handing him the spoon. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but Victor felt it land with weight. Ethan ate steadily, not rushed, not forced. Between bites, he asked Lillian about the corn in the bread. "Did you grow it?" he asked. She smiled softly. "My father used to. In Georgia. I just learned to cook it the way he liked." Ethan nodded as if that detail mattered. Because to him, it did. Victor tasted the soup next. It was not complex. It was not plated like art. It was warm, balanced, honest. He realized something uncomfortable then. Every chef he had hired had cooked to impress him. Lillian was cooking to comfort his son. After dinner, Ethan did not retreat to his room. He stayed at the table, swinging his feet lightly under the chair, asking if he could help wash dishes. The staff froze again, unsure whether to intervene. Victor gave a small nod. "Let him," he said quietly. Lillian guided Ethan to the sink, showing him how to rinse a bowl without splashing water across the counter. Their voices blended in low conversation, not about grief, not about loss, but about simple things like how much salt was enough and why bread rises in the oven. Victor stood at a distance, watching his son laugh softly when soap bubbles slipped from his fingers. It had been months since he had heard that sound. One of the senior chefs stepped forward carefully. "Sir, what are your instructions regarding tomorrow's menu?" Victor kept his eyes on Ethan. "Cancel the tasting contracts," he replied evenly. "We will restructure the kitchen." The chef hesitated. "And Miss Brooks?" Victor finally turned, his expression calm but firm. "Miss Brooks will be here in the morning." Across the room, Ethan looked up quickly, searching his father's face. Victor met his son's eyes and gave the slightest nod. Ethan exhaled, relief passing over him like sunlight breaking through cloud cover. And in that quiet Chicago evening, surrounded by marble floors and guarded gates, it became clear that something far more powerful than reputation had just been restored. The next morning the Romano mansion woke earlier than usual, not because of an emergency, but because word had spread through every corridor that the kitchen was no longer operating under the old rules. Lillian arrived just after 7 o'clock, the Chicago air still crisp, carrying nothing but her handbag and a quiet sense of resolve. She had expected security to question her again, but the gate opened without delay. Inside, the grand kitchen felt different, less theatrical, more watchful. Half of the remaining chefs had already been dismissed before sunrise. Contracts terminated. Catering partnerships paused. The head house manager stood near the island counter reviewing a revised staffing list with tight lips. Victor Romano believed in decisive action. When he shifted direction, he did not drift. He pivoted. Ethan was already downstairs, seated at the counter instead of the formal dining table. He had insisted on waiting in the kitchen. When Lillian stepped inside, he did not hesitate. He smiled, small but unmistakable. "You came back," he said. Lillian returned the smile. "I said I would." Victor entered moments later, dressed not in a tailored suit, but in a simple dark sweater, sleeves pushed back. It was a subtle change, but everyone noticed. He nodded once to Lillian. "Good morning, Miss Brooks." "Good morning, sir." There was no ceremony, no announcement. Instead, Victor placed a thin folder on the counter. "You will not be working as a delivery substitute today," he said evenly. "If you are willing, I would like you to oversee my son's meals moving forward. Directly. No intermediaries." The room stilled. The house manager blinked. A private culinary director position in the Romano estate was one of the most coveted roles in the city. Lillian looked at the folder, but did not touch it. "I am not trained like your other chefs," she replied calmly. "I cook simple food." Victor's expression did not shift. Simple as working. Ethan tugged lightly at her sleeve again, this time less out of fear and more out of trust. Can we make pancakes? He asked. Lillian glanced at Victor for permission. Victor did not hesitate. You can make whatever he will eat. There was no resentment in his voice, only clarity. Lillian washed her hands and began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. Flour, eggs, milk. She explained each step to Ethan as she measured, letting him crack an egg carefully into the bowl. A small shell fragment slipped in, and he looked worried, but she showed him how to remove it gently with the edge of a spoon. Victor watched from a distance, arms folded, absorbing a lesson no business mentor had ever taught him. Authority could command loyalty. It could enforce silence, but it could not create comfort. The smell of butter hitting the warm skillet filled the kitchen, not extravagant, not expensive, but grounding. When Ethan tasted the first pancake, syrup drizzling slowly across the surface, he did not glance around for approval. He simply ate. Victor picked up the folder again and slid it closer to Lillian. The compensation reflects a permanent position, he said. Full benefits. Housing if you prefer it. Lillian met his gaze steadily. I do not need luxury, she answered. I just need to know he will be allowed to feel. Victor paused at that. In his world, feelings were often liabilities. Yet standing in his own kitchen, watching his son laugh softly over a slightly uneven pancake, he understood something that no boardroom could measure. The house had been run with precision. Now it would be run with care. By the end of the week, the transformation inside the Romano mansion was impossible to ignore. The kitchen, once a stage for reputation and competition, now moved at a steadier rhythm. There were fewer uniforms, fewer whispered debates about presentation, and more conversations about what Ethan felt like eating that day. Lillian did not redesign the space. She simply changed its purpose. She arrived each morning at 7:30, sometimes with a small paper bag of fresh herbs from a neighborhood market, sometimes with nothing but a plan formed on her commute across the city. Ethan began waking earlier. Instead of retreating into silence, he waited at the counter with a notebook Lillian had given him, where he wrote down meal ideas in careful, uneven handwriting. Scrambled eggs with cheese. Turkey sandwiches cut into squares. Oatmeal with sliced bananas. The requests were not extravagant, but they were consistent. Victor noticed the difference in measurable ways first. Ethan's energy returned. His teachers reported that he was participating again in class. The dark circles under his eyes began to fade. But what Victor could not quantify was the sound that had returned to the house. Laughter. It echoed lightly from the kitchen to the hallway, from the hallway to the staircase, soft but steady. One afternoon, while Lillian showed Ethan how to measure rice using a simple 1-cup scoop, Victor stood in the doorway observing. Why does it matter how level the cup is? Ethan asked, tilting the scoop unevenly. Lillian smiled and used the flat edge of a knife to smooth the top. Because small details change the whole result, she explained. Too much and it overflows. Too little and it stays hard. Victor felt the words settle somewhere deeper than cooking instructions. That evening, a scheduled meeting with 2 business partners was moved from the formal dining room to a smaller private sitting area. When one of the men casually inquired about the recent staffing changes in the Romano kitchen, Victor answered without apology. My son's well-being comes first, he said evenly. There was no explanation beyond that. The message was clear. Later that night, as Ethan finished a bowl of warm rice and grilled chicken, he looked at Lillian with a seriousness beyond his years. Are you going to leave? He asked quietly. The question was not dramatic. It was honest. Lillian paused, drying her hands on a dish towel. She glanced at Victor, then back at Ethan. I am here, she said gently. Victor stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on his son's shoulder. She is not going anywhere, he confirmed. It was not a contract speaking. It was a father. Ethan nodded, satisfied, and returned to his meal. In the reflection of the kitchen window, Victor caught sight of the 3 of them standing there together. Marble counters. Soft light. A woman who had arrived as a delivery substitute now anchoring the heart of his home. He had once believed control meant strength. Now he understood something quieter and far more enduring. Strength was allowing what truly mattered to stay. Not everyone was pleased with the change inside the Romano estate. By the second week, the shift in hierarchy had become a quiet headline among those who paid attention to Victor Romano's decisions. Investors who once discussed menu pairings and imported wines were now hearing that the grand kitchen had been simplified. A culinary director from Manhattan called personally, offering to return at half his previous fee. Victor declined without hesitation. Inside the mansion, the remaining senior staff gathered one afternoon in the library, their concern carefully framed as professionalism. The house manager spoke first. "Sir, with respect, the estate's reputation has always reflected excellence. Reducing the culinary program may send the wrong message." Victor stood by the tall window overlooking the manicured lawn, hands clasped behind his back. "What message do you believe matters more?" he asked evenly. No one answered immediately. In the kitchen, unaware of the discussion, Lillian was teaching Ethan how to knead biscuit dough on a lightly floured counter. His small hands pressed into the soft mixture, uneven at first, then steadier under her guidance. "Do not rush it," she reminded him gently. "If you push too hard, it becomes tough." Ethan looked up. "Like people?" She smiled faintly. "Sometimes." Victor entered mid-conversation and paused, watching the flour dust cling to his son's sleeves. In the past, he would have corrected the mess instantly. Now he simply rolled up his own sleeves and stepped forward. "Show me," he said. Ethan's face lit with surprise. Lillian handed Victor a small portion of dough. "Press with your palm," she instructed. "Fold. Turn. Repeat." Victor followed exactly as told. The gesture did not diminish him. It grounded him. That evening, a formal dinner remained on the calendar, a long-standing obligation with influential partners. The table was set elegantly, but the menu was simple: roasted chicken, seasonal vegetables, fresh biscuits, and apple pie. When one guest raised an eyebrow at the modest spread, Victor answered calmly before any explanation was requested. "This is what my family is eating." The tone left no room for criticism. Upstairs later, Ethan sat at the edge of his bed as Lillian read a short story aloud. Victor leaned against the doorway, listening. The house felt lived in rather than staged. After the story ended, Ethan hesitated before speaking. "Dad, are you mad that we do not have fancy food anymore?" Victor crossed the room and sat beside him. "No," he said quietly. "I am learning that what looks impressive is not always what is needed." Ethan nodded, satisfied with the answer. As Lillian turned off the bedside lamp, Victor realized the resistance from staff and associates was fading, not because they agreed, but because the results were undeniable. His son was healthier. The house was warmer. And the woman who had once been nearly invisible at the service entrance now stood at the center of a transformation no contract could have engineered. The mansion had not lost status. It had found balance. The change inside the Romano estate did not remain a private matter for long. By the third week, whispers had turned into direct inquiries. A prominent lifestyle magazine requested a feature on the new domestic philosophy of Victor Romano. An influential associate hinted that simplicity might be misinterpreted as instability. Victor listened without interruption, then declined every interview. He had spent years cultivating an image of precision and power. Now he was protecting something quieter. One afternoon, a longtime business partner arrived unannounced, stepping into the kitchen just as Lillian was showing Ethan how to season tomato sauce with fresh basil. The man glanced around at the absence of uniformed chefs and the lack of elaborate plating. "This is the famous restructuring?" he asked lightly, though his tone carried doubt. Victor did not bristle. He leaned against the counter and watched Ethan stir the sauce with focused determination. "It is called prioritizing," he replied evenly. The partner studied Lillian for a moment longer than necessary. "You replaced 50 professionals with one home cook." Lillian did not look up. She continued guiding Ethan's hand. "Slow circles," she reminded him. Victor's voice lowered slightly, not in threat, but in clarity. "I replaced performance with purpose." The room went quiet. Ethan lifted the spoon and tasted the sauce, considering carefully before nodding. "Needs a little salt," he said with confidence. Lillian handed him the shaker. Victor noticed the change again. His son was not withdrawing anymore. He was deciding. Later that evening, after the guest had left without further comment, Victor found Lillian on the back terrace overlooking the lake. The wind moved gently through her braid as she stood with a cup of tea in her hands. "You understand," he said thoughtfully, "that my world is not accustomed to change without resistance." Lillian looked out at the water before answering. "Children are not accustomed to silence without consequences." Victor absorbed that in stillness. He had once believed that maintaining control meant anticipating every external threat. Now he realized he had nearly overlooked the internal one. Ethan's grief had not been loud. It had been quiet and retreating. That night, Victor walked past the formal dining room and paused. The 12-foot marble table remained polished, untouched, waiting for grandeur. Instead of feeling pride, he felt distance. He turned away and headed toward the kitchen, where Ethan and Lillian were baking a small apple crisp for dessert. The scent filled the hallway, warm and familiar. When Ethan laughed at a spill of cinnamon on the counter, Victor did not correct him. He picked up a cloth and wiped it gently, staying present. In that simple act, under soft kitchen lighting rather than crystal chandeliers, Victor understood something no investor report could quantify. Authority could command obedience. It could secure loyalty, but it could not replace the steady hands of someone who chose to stay. And in a house once defined by reputation, the most powerful decision had been to protect the one person his son would not let leave. The first time Ethan invited a friend over for dinner again, the staff moved cautiously, unsure whether the fragile progress would hold under outside eyes. The long marble dining table remained untouched. Instead, 3 place settings were arranged at the smaller oak table near the kitchen windows. Lillian had prepared baked chicken with rosemary, roasted sweet potatoes, and warm cornbread, the kind that filled the room with a gentle, familiar scent. Rather than an overwhelming display, Ethan introduced her without hesitation. "This is Miss Lillian. She cooks with me." There was no embarrassment in his voice, only pride. Victor stood nearby, observing not just his son, but himself. Months ago he would have ensured that the meal impressed the visiting family, that every detail signaled power. Now he noticed something different. Ethan was talking, laughing, explaining how to measure flour evenly and why salt had to be added slowly. The friend's mother complimented the food sincerely. "It feels like home," she said. Victor met Lillian's eyes across the counter, and for a brief second, there was understanding. Later that evening, after the guests left and the house grew quiet again, Victor called a full staff meeting in the main foyer. The chandeliers glowed above them, reflecting off polished stone floors. The remaining employees stood in a semicircle, waiting for direction. Victor did not raise his voice. He did not pace. He simply spoke. "This house will operate differently from now on," he said evenly. "We are not removing standards. We are redefining them." He turned slightly toward Lillian, who stood modestly near the back, uncomfortable with attention. "Miss Brooks is not temporary staff. She is permanent family support." The word family carried weight. It was not spoken lightly in his world. There were no objections this time. Results had silenced resistance. As the meeting dispersed, Ethan walked directly to Lillian and slipped his small hand into hers. "You are staying, right?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. She knelt slightly to meet his eyes. "I am staying," she said softly. Victor stepped closer, placing a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "And so am I," he added, not as a correction, but as a promise. In the weeks that followed, the Romano mansion no longer felt like a monument to reputation. It felt lived in. Meals were shared at the kitchen table more often than the formal dining room. Laughter traveled more freely through the hallways, and the headlines that once speculated about instability quietly faded as business continued without disruption. Strength had not diminished. It had matured. One evening, as the sun set across Lake Michigan and cast gold across the glass walls, Victor stood watching Ethan help Lillian roll out dough for homemade bread. Flour dusted their sleeves. The kitchen lights glowed warmly. For the first time since winter, the house did not echo with absence. It breathed with presence. And in that quiet moment, Victor understood that power had never been about how many people he could command to stay. It was about recognizing the one person his son could not bear to lose and choosing to let her remain.